The snow fell thick and silent, blanketing the village in white death. The forests were bare, the firewood gone, and yet the peasants did not freeze. In a time when warmth meant survival, how did entire medieval communities outlast winter? Without fuel for fire. This isn't a tale of luxury. This is the true story of endurance, adaptation, and forgotten methods, where warmth came not from flame, but from ingenuity passed down through generations. Snow didn't just fall in medieval Europe, it invaded. In northern and eastern regions, winters lasted months longer than the modern calendar suggests. By late autumn, the ground was already hard. The sun rarely pierced the grey skies, and temperatures plunged well below freezing. A winter wasn't measured by the number of days it snowed, but by how many people made it out alive. In remote villages scattered across Scandinavia, the Baltics, and Slavic territories, entire communities faced these conditions without access to the one thing most people today take for granted: fuel. Forests that once blanketed the landscape had been stripped cleared for agriculture, devoured by growing populations, or locked away behind feudal restrictions. In many places, cutting trees without the Lord's permission was a punishable offense. When wood ran out, options were few. Peat bogs, where they existed, were backbreaking to dig and froze over quickly. Charcoal was expensive and reserved for metalwork. Animal dung was used when possible, but its heat was weak and it stank. Some villages had nothing, no fuel. Fire. Without fire, survival became something else entirely. Houses weren't warmed, meals weren't hot. Water often froze indoors. Daily life shifted into survival mode. People didn't wake with the sun, they stayed under layers of wool and straw as long as possible. Every step outside risked frostbite. Basic tasks, like collecting water or tending animals, became acts of endurance. The death toll in harsh winters could be staggering. Chroniclers in monastic centers like Novgorod recorded entire seasons where the elderly and infants perished in large numbers. Malnutrition, combined with cold, killed silently. The poor were hit hardest. Many slept in huts, packed with mud and straw, with little insulation and no consistent heat source. But people adapted, not with comfort, but with strategy. Communities developed alternative ways to stay alive when firewood wasn't an option. Their solutions were crude but effective, born from necessity rather than invention. What followed was not just survival but a slow evolution in architecture, diet, and social behavior that helped entire populations endure the coldest periods in medieval history. The question isn't just how they survived without fire, it's how they lasted for centuries under conditions that would cripple most modern settlements. This was winter not as a season but as a threat, and survival depended on everything except the flame dot. By the 13th century, Europe's population had exploded. More mouths meant more homes, more cooking fires, and more demand for the most basic fuel of all wood. Forests that once stretched across England, France, Germany, and beyond were steadily carved away. Trees weren't just cut for heat, they were felled for building homes, clearing farmland, feeding forges, and supplying endless manorial estates. This demand collided with poor forest management. There were no replanting programs, no sustainable harvesting methods. Entire regions, particularly in Western and Central Europes, saw their tree cover disappear within a few generations. In places like Flanders, where scarcity was already a crisis by the early 1200s, chroniclers from the period describe villages walking several miles just to gather bundles of twigs. But it wasn't just about supply. Access to wood was often legally restricted. Forests were owned, not shared. A large portion of woodland in medieval England, for instance, was classified as royal forest. Under Norman and later Plantagenet law, these were off-limits to peasants. Cutting wood without permission could lead to heavy fines or mutilation. Even outside royal land, local lords controlled access to timber. Peasants could collect dead wood or fallen branches, but cutting live trees was usually forbidden. The church held vast tracts of land as well. Monastic institutions like Cluny or the Cistercian abbeys enforced strict boundaries. Monks needed fuel too, especially for baking, brewing, and blacksmithing, so even sacred lands saw conflict over resources. Local villagers sometimes resorted to poaching wood at night, risking brutal punishment for a few armloads of fuel to survive. Many communities turned to alternatives. Peat was dug from bogs in Ireland, Scotland, and the Low Countries. It burned with a steady heat, but required enormous labor to extract, dry, and transport. Charcoal made by slow-burning wood in pits was hotter and cleaner, but consumed far more timber than it saved. It became largely reserved for craftspeople like smiths and potters. Animal dung was collected, shaped into patties, and left to dry in the sun. In arid or treeless zones, like parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, it became a mainstay. But its heat was weak, and it produced choking smoke. Straw, hay, and even dried moss were pressed into use, though these burned quickly and offered little warmth in harsh winters. Even these substitutes failed. Poor harvests meant less straw. Overgrazed fields meant fewer animals and less dung. Peat bogs froze solid. Charcoal required wood that no longer existed. Fuel scarcity didn't just mean discomfort. It meant no bread oven, no way to boil water, no defense against frost. Entire villages were left to endure cold with nothing but their clothing and each other. The medieval fuel crisis was never a single event. It was a constant pressure shaped by law, greed, poor planning, and an ecosystem pushed to its limits. And it would reshape how people lived, built, and survived for centuries. In most medieval villages, warmth wasn't a feature of the home, it was a strategy applied to the body. Instead of trying to heat entire rooms, people learned to trap what little heat they produced and carry it with them. In regions where firewood was scarce and homes were barely insulated, survival depended on the insulation of flesh, fabric, and habit. Wool was the foundation. It was everywhere, spun by hand, woven on village looms, layered relentlessly. Undergarments, tunics, cloaks, and hoods were often made from untreated or lightly washed wool, retaining the lanolin oils that gave it water resistance. Felted, wool compressed, and matted offered even better protection, and by the 12th century it became common for outer layers, especially among the lower classes. In colder climates, fur linings and leather caps added extra defense. Sheepskin coats, fox, fur collars, and deerskin mitts weren't luxuries. They were survival tools. Even in parts of England, which saw milder winters than Scandinavia or Poland, fur trim was used by peasants who had access to small game. The poor couldn't afford imported furs, but local pelts were sometimes bartered or inherited. Layering was constant. Garments weren't changed daily, they were added or removed depending on weather. The idea of indoor clothes was alien. Homes were rarely more than a few degrees warmer than the air outside. Most rooms had no chimney, just a smoke hole or cracks in the roof. so any fire used for cooking offered little lasting heat. It was more efficient to trap warmth close to the skin. At night, the solution was proximity. Entire families often shared one bed. In crowded cottages, grandparents, parents, children and, sometimes hired laborers, slept shoulder to shoulder under coarse wool blankets and straw-stuffed mattresses. Bed curtains were used in wealthier homes, but for villagers, bodies were. The insulation, infants and toddlers, were often wrapped tight in cloth and pressed between adults for warmth. The same was true for animals. In many medieval homes, particularly in Northern and Eastern Europe, the livestock lived under the same roof. Cows, pigs, and goats were brought into the home or attached stable area each evening. Their body heat helped maintain a survivable interior temperature. It wasn't comfort. It was calculation. This structure, sometimes called a byre-dwelling, was common across the Scottish Highlands, Alpine valleys, parts of Scandinavia, and Eastern Slavic settlements. The shared space served a dual purpose. It preserved animal health in freezing conditions, and it contributed significantly to human warmth by the late Middle Ages. Especially between the 13th and 15th centuries, this method of survival had become cultural norm. There were no complaints in the historical record about crowding or smell-a-lonely references to keeping warm and staying alive. Heating the body, not the home, wasn't a philosophy. It was the only option. In the absence of fire, warmth came from what you wore, who you slept beside, and what shared the space around you. A typical medieval peasant home didn't have separate rooms. There was no hallway, no upstairs, no privacy. In most of rural Europe, the entire household, parents, children, and sometimes extended canal, lived, worked, ate, and slept in a single, multi-purpose space. These were not houses built for comfort. They were built to retain every possible scrap of heat. In regions like Saxony, Picardy, and the Polish countryside, the basic layout remained consistent across centuries. A one-room structure with a low roof, thick earthen or waterland walls, and a single hearth. The hearth was the heart of the home, but not in the way modern viewers might think. It was often unvented, filling the air with smoke. Fires were kept small, if lit at all. Fuel was precious and usually reserved for cooking, not warmth. To preserve heat, families relied on proximity. Beds were shared, not out of affection, but necessity. A husband and wife might sleep with their children tucked between them, wrapped in heavy wool or rough linens. In winter, sleeping arrangements grew tighter. Grandparents, cousins, even hired laborers might join in the same bed or bundle nearby on straw mats. There were no pajamas. People slept in their day clothes, sometimes adding an extra tunic or hood. The heat didn't come from the fire. It came from the people themselves. Human bodies produce roughly 100 watts of heat at rest. Multiply that by 5 or 6 individuals, and the room temperature rose noticeably. In many cases, even that wasn't enough. So animals were brought inside. Cows, goats, sheep, and chickens weren't just protected from the elements, they were integrated into the home. This practice, widespread in alpine regions, the Scottish Highlands, Scandinavia, and parts of the Balkans, is well documented. The byre-dwelling where humans and animals shared a wall or even the same space served dual functions. It kept livestock alive through freezing nights and contributed to interior warmth through body heat. Dung was a problem, but one that had routine solutions. Floors were packed earth, sometimes covered with straw, regularly turned and refreshed. In colder climates, A slight elevation was built for the human sleeping area, separating it from the livestock pen by a wooden partition or simple railing. The smell was tolerated. The benefit was survival. Windows, if present, were small slits, or covered with greased parchment or oiled cloth, just enough to let in light without sacrificing insulation. Roofs were thatched and angled to trap rising heat. Doors were low and often covered with hanging cloth or animal skins. Communal living wasn't just a way of life, it was the only available insulation strategy. The more bodies in the room, the more heat was retained. And over time, these conditions became culturally embedded. Modesty around sleeping arrangements faded. Warmth took precedence over space. In these single-room homes, survival depended not on solitude, but on shared breath, shared walls, and shared warmth. The cold pressed from outside, but inside. The medieval household responded not with technology, but with bodies, packed close, night after night. Medieval homes were not designed for comfort. They were built to survive. In cold regions of Europe, where winters stretched long and bitter, architecture wasn't a luxury, it was a response to the threat of exposure and death. The most common rural home was a single-room structure, often called a croft hovel or cottage, depending on the region. It served multiple purposes: shelter, storage, workshop, kitchen, and stableland. Its design was driven by one priority: retain every ounce of heat. Roofing came first. Thatch, made from tightly bundled reeds or straw, wasn't just readily available, it was highly effective. Layers could be up to 2 feet thick, forming a dense thermal cap that trapped rising warmth. When properly maintained and compacted, a thatch roof could last up to 30 years, repelling rain, snow, and wind. In areas like East Anglia, where thatching traditions ran deep, entire villages were topped in golden, insulating layers. Beneath the roof, ceilings were low by design. In contrast to the vaulted halls of castles or monasteries, peasant homes compressed vertical space to concentrate warmth where it was most needed around the human body. Smoke from the hearth collected in the rafters, forming a barrier against the cold air seeping through the thatch. There were no chimneys in most homes before the 15th century. Instead, smoke exited through a small louver or gap near the roofline, leaving the rest of the structure steeped in thick, acrid haze. Unpleasant, but effective. Walls were constructed using local materials. In much of England, wattle and daub dominated, woven wooden lattice packed with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung. Once dried, this formed a thick, semi-insulated barrier. In Scandinavia and the Alpine regions, timber framing and log walls were more common, providing sturdier resistance to the cold. In Eastern Europe, especially in Slavic territories, sod houses built with layers of earth offered natural insulation that performed better than wood in permafrost conditions. Windows were minimal. Glass was rare and expensive. Most peasants relied on small openings covered with oiled parchment, animal hide, or wooden shutters. The goal wasn't to let in light, it was to keep out the wind. Some homes had no windows at all. Illumination came from the hearth, candles made of tallow, or rushlights soaked in fat. The floor was usually bare earth, but even here, people adapted. Straw or dried rushes were spread thickly, providing both insulation and a form of crude carpeting. In colder regions, floors were built slightly raised using packed clay mixed with reeds, helping reduce moisture and draft. In wealthier or better-built homes, wooden planks were sometimes used. Though they remained cold and offered little advantage, unless properly sealed. Windbreaks surrounded the home where possible. Hedges, stone walls, or stacked firewood acted as barriers against prevailing winds. Homes were often built into hillsides or nestled between natural formations to block gusts and snowdrifts. In mountain settlements across Austria or Switzerland, homes were even partially buried to shield them from exposure. Everything about these structures reflected a mindset focused not on generating heat, but on trapping what little heat already existed. Warmth came from human bodies, animals, cooking fires, and layers of fabric. The architecture's job was to hold that heat in place for as long as possible. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't sanitary, but it worked. Generation after generation endured harsh winters, not through abundance, but through intelligent design passed down not from architects, but from necessity, trial, and cold experience. In the medieval world, warmth began from within. Without reliable fuel or central heating, food became more than nourishment. It was the body's defense against cold. What peasants ate during the winter months wasn't random. It was a calculated survival mechanism, shaped by tradition, scarcity, and centuries of practical knowledge. Daily meals centered around one principle: caloric density. Gruels and potagistic mixtures of grains, legumes, and seasonal vegetables formed the bulk of the diet across Europe. Barley, oats, rye, and millet were boiled into a starchy base, then thickened with beans, onions, or turnips. These slow-burning carbohydrates provided long-lasting energy and helped maintain core body temperature during labor in freezing conditions. Fat played a critical role. In a world without heating, excess calories weren't a luxury, they were essential insulation. Pork, fat, suet, and butter were used liberally where available. In regions like Bavaria, southern Poland, and the Low Countries, peasants raised pigs. For more than meat, the rendered lard became a cooking staple. It was added to pottage, smeared on coarse bread, or used to fry root vegetables. In colder zones like Scandinavia and Rus, animal fat wasn't just consumed, was stockpiled. Tallow rendered from beef or mutton was stored in ceramic pots and rationed carefully through the coldest months. Fermentation helped preserve grains and enhance their nutritional value. In areas without access to fresh produce, fermented rye porridge or sour barley mash became important staples. In Slavic regions, kvasa, lightly alcoholic beverage made from fermented breadfruit, both hydration and calories. Sauerkraut, pickled turnips, and other fermented vegetables provided vitamin C, reducing the risk of scurvy during long winters without fruit. Hot stews became the centerpiece of warmth. Simmered for hours, sometimes days, over low embers, these meals extracted every bit of nutrition from bone, fat, and leftover scraps. Bones were boiled for marrow. Tough cuts of meat were rendered tender through slow heat. Even without abundant firewood, villagers kept pots warm using residual heat from cooking stones or embers buried in ash. The pot rarely left the hearth. It was refilled as needed, with whatever ingredients were on hand. Hunger shaped the rhythm of the year. In spring and summer, lighter foods appeared: greens, eggs, berries, but these were short-lived as autumn approached. Preparations for winter intensified. Grain was threshed and stored. Root vegetables were buried in pits. Animals were slaughtered selectively. Many could not be fed through the cold months. The meat was salted, smoked, or dried. Organ meats were consumed immediately. Blood, often mixed with oats or barley, became blood sausager, dense, protein-rich. Food that required no refrigeration. By December, Meals had become heavier, saltier, and slower. Winter food was not about taste. It was about endurance. Every spoonful of barley stew or lardsmid bread served the same goal: keep the body fed, warm, and moving. In a time where a fire might not be burning and the walls could not keep out the wind, the body was fortified from the inside. Survival was not only a matter of shelter, but of sustenance, planned and prepared to carry families through the cold. Cold was not an inconvenience in the medieval world. It was constant. It shaped daily life, redefined the idea of comfort, and trained generations to endure rather than resist. Unlike today, where central heating, thermal wear, and hot water are expected, medieval Europeans lived with the cold, not against it. Children grew up without the idea of a warm home. Indoors was only marginally better than outdoors. Clothes weren't removed at night. Baths were rare, and cold feet, chapped hands, and breath visible in the air indoors were simply normal. Chronic cold exposure wasn't seen as a crisis. It was routine. Monastic texts from the 12th and 13th centuries mention monks waking to find frost on their robes or ice in their washing basins. They noted it without complaint. It was just winter. The human body can adapt. Long-term exposure to cold leads to physiological changes: increased basal metabolic rates, improved circulation, thicker skin, and a higher cold tolerance. Medieval people didn't need to be told how to do this. They lived it. They worked in the fields in early morning frost, fed livestock with bare hands, and broke ice to reach drinking water. Sleep schedules shifted around daylight and labor. In agrarian life, the day began before sunrise, even in freezing months. Men trudged through frozen soil to check livestock. Women carried water from wells with their breath curling into the darkness. There was no waiting for the sun. Tasks had to be done, no matter the temperature. Religious culture reinforced this tolerance. Fasting was practiced even during the coldest weeks of the year. Lent, beginning in late winter, required abstaining from meat, dairy, and often warm, hearty meals replaced with dried fish, root vegetables, and bread. This was not optional. Even monasteries with better provisions upheld strict dietary rules. Fasting wasn't just about discipline, it trained the mind to endure discomfort. Hunger, like cold, was seen as purifying. Records from Cistercian monasteries show that dormitories were kept unheated by rule. Benedictine orders limited fire usage and instructed monks to accept seasonal suffering as part of spiritual life. Among the peasantry, hardship was seen less as misfortune and more as part of the natural order. Survival wasn't expected to be pleasant, it was expected to be possible. There was no culture of complaint. Cold was seasonal, predictable, and shared by everyone. What mattered was endurance. Suffering was normalized, not dramatized. This mindset reduced psychological resistance. Expectations shaped perception, and medieval expectations were calibrated low. A cold floor, a damp blanket, or frozen water didn't cause panic. They were reminders that the season had turned. Modern life is built on avoidance. Climate control, insulation, electric heat, all of it is designed to erase discomfort. But in medieval villages, there was no such illusion. People lived closer to the elements, adapted their routines, and accepted hardship not as failure, but as the fabric of life. Survival was not a triumph. It was the default, not through comfort, but through tolerance, through minds trained to endure what bodies had no choice but to feel. In the medieval cold, suffering was universal. but it wasn't equal. The methods for enduring winter depended not just on climate or geography, but on class, belief, and lifestyle. The peasant, the monk, and the noble faced the same cold with vastly different tools, expectations, and philosophies. For peasants, survival was practical and immediate. Their homes were simple single-room cottages, often shared with livestock, where warmth came from bodies, clothing, and proximity. Fuel was rationed, fires were small, often limited to cooking. The goal was not comfort, but conservation. Every stick of wood had to last. Peasants used dung, straw, and even dried moss when firewood ran out. They layered wool, shared beds, and kept to one or two warm garments throughout the season. In monasteries, cold was not merely endured, was embraced. Ascetic orders, particularly the Cistercians and early Benedictines, imposed strict rules. Against comfort, monastic dormitories were intentionally unheated, even in the depths of winter. According to the rule of Saint Benedict, monks were to live simply, sleep clothed, and rise before dawn for prayers in unheated stone chapels. Warmth was not seen as a right, but as a distraction from spiritual discipline in the 12th century. Bernard of Clairvaux wrote of the Cistercian lifestyle: no fires in sleeping quarters, limited meals, and silence during labor even when fingers went numb from frost. Their survival depended on routine, mental fortitude, and a strict communal rhythm. Fasting during Lent, even in February or March, was enforced with no exemptions for the cold. Illness was not always seen as something to avoid, but sometimes as part of divine trial. Castles, by contrast, offered shelter with more resources, but not absolute protection. Nobles had access to firewood, servants, and stone walls, but stone retained cold. Great halls might have roaring hearths, but private chambers were often frigid. Tapestries hung not just for decoration, but to insulate walls. Straw was scattered across stone floors to reduce the chill. Nobles wore layers of fur and velvet indoors. Yet during severe winters, such as those during the early 14th century climate downturn, even the wealthy complained of fuel shortages. Inventories from noble households showed the high demand for firewood and charcoal during winter. In 1315, during the Great Famine, records from northern France and parts of the Low Countries noted not only food scarcity, but a lack of heating materials. Even well-supplied manors had to limit fires to central halls and kitchens. Across all classes, cold shaped behavior, routines, and expectations. But for peasants, it was a constant presence. For monks, a chosen discipline. For nobles, an inconvenience they could sometimes escape. The body suffered in each case, but the response to the cold was shaped by status, belief, and what was considered necessary for survival. In regions where forests had vanished and the last bundle of firewood had long since been burned, survival demanded resourcefulness. Across medieval Europe, communities turned to fuel sources that today seem improbable: materials overlooked by the wealthy but essential to those who had no other choice. Animal dung became a standard fuel in treeless landscapes. In parts of the Scottish Highlands, the Russian steppe, and even southern France, cattle, sheep, and horse droppings were collected, pressed into flat discs, and dried in the sun. Once hardened, they could be stacked and stored like firewood. When burned, dung produced a slow, steady heat with little flame. The smell was acrid but tolerable. Its heat was weak, but better than none. Hay bricks were another adaptation. Farmers combined straw, chaff, or other plant refuse with mud, then compressed the mixture into blocks and left them to dry. The result was a lightweight, fibrous brick that could smolder for hours. These were often used in simple clay ovens or placed in iron grates to warm enclosed spaces. In Denmark and parts of the Low Countries, these bricks became a seasonal necessity. Dried moss and lichen harvested from marshes or stone walls were also used. In Iceland and northern Scotland, where wood was almost entirely absent, moss was collected during warmer months, dried thoroughly, and stored in sacks. When mixed with a bit of animal fat or pitch, it could sustain a small flame, useful for kindling or maintaining a cooking fire. Rushlights offered another method. Made by dipping dried rushes into tallow or bacon fat, these slender sticks acted as crude candles. They produced dim light and minimal heat, but were reliable in drafty homes with no glass windows. In poorer households across England and Wales, rushlights remained common well into the early modern period. Where possible, heat retention took precedence over fuel consumption. Heated stones were placed into embers, then wrapped in cloth or straw and tucked beneath bedding. In Eastern European settlements, ceramic tiles, often part of masonry stoves, were warmed during the day, radiating heat long after the fire had died. In some Slavic villages, embers were carefully buried under ash to smolder slowly through the night, allowing fires to be rekindled without new fuel each morning. In isolated coastal communities, seaweed was collected, dried, and burned. Its high salt content made it flare and crackle, but it gave off surprising warmth. In parts of Ireland and the Hebrides, villagers even experimented with mixing river mud or sediment with straw to form a crude, flammable paste. These solutions weren't uniform. They varied by region, by necessity, by tradition, but all shared a common trait: adaptation under pressure. Forgotten today, these fuels once stood between survival and frostbite. In a world without options, people made fire from whatever they could refuse, waste, and the overlooked remains of the landscape itself. Central heating, insulated walls, electric stoves, and constant hot water, modern comforts so embedded in daily life, their absence feels unimaginable. Yet for centuries, entire populations endured winters without any of it. What they lacked in technology, they replaced with knowledge, adaptation, and communal resilience. Medieval villages didn't survive brutal winters by chance. They planned seasonally, communally, and instinctively. They understood resource limits long before sustainability became a concept. Wood was rationed because there was no more to cut. Meals were calorically calculated not by science, but by centuries of observation. Heat was shared, warmth wasn't privatized, and endurance was taught from birth. None of it was romantic. It was difficult, cold, and often deadly. But it offers something our modern systems often ignore: the importance of resilience over convenience. Our dependency on centralized energy systems creates a fragile illusion of permanence. Gas lines, electric grids, and supply chains are vulnerable to conflict, climate disruption, and political instability. A prolonged blackout during winter in any major city would expose just how unprepared most people are to live without constant heat. Medieval survival strategies, though primitive by today's standards, remind us that technology isn't the only answer. Insulation can come from architecture, not just power. Community sleeping arrangements weren't ideal, but they preserved lives. Clothing wasn't fashion, it was engineering. Food wasn't constant, it was seasonal, preserved, stored, and consumed with purpose. These communities also practiced what modern planners call thermal zoning. They heated only the spaces they needed, only when they needed them. No hallways, no empty rooms kept warm for comfort. The fire was for the pot, not the room. The bed was warmed by the people in it. Even in today's world, many of these principles remain relevant. Passive housing, design thick walls, small windows. Natural insulation is seeing a revival. Thermal clothing, community heating projects, and low-energy cooking techniques echo old solutions. Not because we want to return to medieval life, but because we can't afford the illusion that our systems will never fail. The past doesn't offer easy blueprints, but it does show that comfort is not the same as survival and that human adaptability, tested across centuries, leaves behind tools more durable than electricity. They're not glamorous, but in times of scarcity, they're remembered, not to glorify hardship, but to recognize that forgetting how people once survived doesn't make us stronger. It makes us more fragile. The cold never left. We just built walls and assumed it couldn't get in. History says otherwise.